Kia ora, everyone. Hope you are excited for another beautiful seminar. Just going to start in another few minutes to let people trickle in. Post-lockdown is busy, isn't it? Many things to do, people to see. You hear the calm of the city all around. The birds are very loud tonight. And one thing I noticed, which made me sad, but it's probably a good thing, is that all the cars returned as soon as lockdown ended. So my very quiet running route has now become once again a thoroughfare. What are the consequences of ending the lockdown? Okay. Today we are delving into the wonderful world of speaking first. I started as very briefly, I started as a third speaker, but third speaking I very quickly found that I don't think my brain can keep up with speaking third, so I switched to first. In fact, I probably spent most of my debating career at first, so I have spoken first at multiple joint scrolls. I speak first at every Easter's, so a lot of first speaking, and I really like it. It has some unique. It requires a slightly different approach to the rest of the debate, because essentially what you're trying to do is give your team the best chance at winning the issues at the end of the debate, but you're doing so from a position where the pathway to get to that end of the debate is still quite far away. So much of the debate happens after you that it relies on some quite unique skills to make sure that you have a strong impact in the debate and can stay relevant as the debate goes forward. And in fact, a lot of what I'll discuss here is potentially also relevant to think about if you are an opening team in BP, the overall way of making sure that your analysis sticks, that you really strongly ground things in a short, sharp way, is a skill that is particularly necessary for BP, but is often quite relevant and useful even when you're in an Australs style situation. And the reason why I'd encourage everyone to keep watching the next 3 videos, each dedicated to a particular speaker within the 3v3 broader 3v3 format, is because it's very useful to understand what other speakers are doing and what they're trying to achieve. Both because it helps you deconstruct that if you're dealing with the opposition, figuring out what a good first speech looks like helps you if you're a second speaker or even a third speaker at figuring out what gaps have been left by the opposition, but equally, figuring out what gaps that your own team has left and that's necessary for you to fill, and how to exploit the useful things or act in concert with the useful things that earlier speakers should be doing to set you up within the rest of the debate. I often think it's particularly useful if you're a first speaker to make sure you listen to the episodes on second speakers and third speakers, because I think a lot of what I'll be discussing there is how to take the material that's given at first and use it in an effective way. And so if you are a first speaker really looking to get the edge, often it's not necessarily about what you say in the abstract. It's about how what you say can be used by later speakers in an effective manner within the overall debate. So today I'm going to break it down into roughly 3 areas. Again, firstly, looking at that, just as I do with almost every debating circumstance, looking at the 2 foundational principles that are necessary to get your head around when you're debating: the idea of a comparative, that we're comparing 2 things, and the idea of a framework, telling the judge what you need to do to win the debate, and how you should be approaching those 2 concepts from a first speaker when there's going to be a lot of evolution coming after you, and making sure you're able to ground the debate within those principles really strongly. Secondly, I'm going to chat to you about style. So looking at the different things that set apart different stylistically effective first speakers, and what are ways you can amp up your particular style in order to give yourself the best forward foot as a team. Because remember, when you're the first speaker, you are the first words that come out of your team. So stylistically, there's a huge amount you can do to set the tone of a debate. And then thirdly, I'll just look at structure, ways in which, from the practical administrative side, you should be approaching your first speeches in order to make sure that you cover everything, but you also present it in a way that starts giving your team momentum, starts helping the adjudicator understand where you think the debate is going to end up. So, as always, if you have any particular questions, just throw me a comment down below. I will answer them live during the show. We can have a bit of a discussion about them. And hopefully you have lots of thoughts about this, because I know roughly 1/3 of you will speak first. And I know slightly more than 1/3 of you will probably speak first in a non-3v3 style as well, because obviously there's only 2 positions in BP. So one of you has to take Prime Minister. So roughly half of you should be thinking about ways that you can really strongly impact your team's case when you are the first speaker who brings out that particular idea or is able to engage with it at all. Neat. So let me just get up the comment section. I hope I don't. This says something went wrong. Is this working for everyone? It says something went wrong. It seems to be going well. It's just not working on my laptop. Okay, yeah. So I will have on my phone everyone's contributions if they want to add anything particular. So let's dive into that first broader concept, and I will have gone on about it quite a lot as we have done these series of seminars. I really think they are the fundamental principles you need to understand when setting up your case and thinking about things, and that's the comparative and the framework. So a few episodes ago, we had an episode on introductions, and I'd advise you to go look at that because we had quite a strong discussion of the value of the first time ideas are introduced, or what you should be doing with the first moments where you have the judge's attention, where you're introducing stuff that is particularly novel. And in many ways, the way of thinking that we have around introductions equally applies to first speakers. They are bringing analysis and points that it's the first time they are discussed within the debate, and they're going to be wanting to give them particular impetus and particular momentum when in the knowledge that they can be fleshed out, adjusted, stretched, evolved from the later speakers within a debate. So let's look at framework first. How do you strongly convince yourself, convince the adjudicator that they should be considering the debate from a particular perspective? The first thing is to note is you do need to really understand what is necessary to win the debate. And as a first speaker, you're often going to be the scribe for the team. You're going to be trying to put together the case, and you need to be pressing your other speakers on what is our framework for winning this debate? What do we think the adjudicator needs to care about? How do we go through it? And then often within your introduction as a first speaker, you want to include those ideas, if not explicitly, at least implicitly in how you structure the case. I would advocate quite strongly for first speakers to structure their case as though it is a logical progression by which the judge can follow in order to get to the result that you want them to do. So firstly, why we believe that this is the most important thing. Secondly, how do we achieve this particularly important thing? And then of course the debate will break apart, it'll grow into particular angles, and different things will become relevant. But remember, you have second and third speakers who have the ability to shape that debate in a more concrete way, in a more granular way, when you actually have a very strong comparative with what the other team has brought. So your job is to put down those foundations and then just start piling material into them to give your second and third speakers something to play with. So if you have that perspective guiding your speech throughout your entire speech, like what is necessary to convince the judge that we're going to win, that is something that is very useful for you to do as a first speaker. And while understanding the framework, make sure that you aren't spending huge amounts of time discussing things that aren't important or aren't doing a good enough job at impacting things. I actually think the more important thing for a first speaker to think about is the idea of the comparative. What you're doing as a first speaker is twofold. A, you're trying to give momentum to your team, and B, you're trying to make it so that your other speakers later within the debate can get the debate to a point where they can then win it for you. Because obviously, having later speakers who can respond to stuff, even with not like great responses, introduces a degree of randomness, a degree of danger as a first speaker, that your material will, simply by virtue of being early, won't have particular impact within the debate. So the way in which I think that this can be got around for a first speaker is to think of your role much less of as a finisher of presenting ideas that all the way to the end are thought of in every particular possible angle, and more about creating a foundation for the debate. And often the way in which that manifests is you spend more time discussing the context, you spend more time laying the foundations of characterization, you spend more time really walking through in a storytelling narrative way, the way in which systems operate and the way in which incentives operate. And so often what I think is incredibly useful is actually just when you are a first speaker, devoting particular blocks of your speech to fully walking through how you think particular actors operate, what they think about, what they care about, to the degree that it can be a little bit overkill, because importantly, that's the thing that you can do within your speech that doesn't need to be 100% pointed directly at what the opposition's bringing, because you don't often, if you're the first affirming, you don't know what the opposition's going to bring. You don't know how they're going to evolve the debate later on. But it's creating a useful wealth of matter and material within the debate that allows your second and third speakers enough room to move and enough room to negotiate in order to create new avenues for winning the debate. So having useful incentive analysis that they can then weaponize in a myriad of different ways against unpredictable analysis that comes out of the opposition's case, but more than just creating this foundation that can be used by your second and third speaker, you want to give the judge the impression that you are speaking from a place of solidity, that you are speaking from a really well-rounded world, because if you set that tone for your case, a very reasonable tone, a tone that feels fleshed out and developed and clear, that makes it so much easier for the judge to start taking those 50-50 assumptions or assertions that could go one way or could go the other way, and driving it towards the material that is useful for your case. And so often the way that this will play out within a first speech is you'll have a first point or even just like the appendage of a point that really just sets out what you believe is important within the debate, why you think you can win, what your framework within the debate is, and then the points that then flow on from it will correspond to that framework, but will be much more deeply concerned with fleshing out the world, will often be more about telling the stories of the particular points you want to bring, rather than barreling through 500 even ifs, trying to respond to everything else. First speeches do well when they're quite simple. They do well when they tell effective stories rather than just being like like sometimes I think we can get a little bit too machine-like with the way that we operate in terms of actually giving in first speeches. And when really what you should be doing is trying to provide that solidity to the judge in order for them to start believing all the other claims that are going to be flowing on from speakers within the debate. So I think if we have then there a solid understanding of what sets a first speaker apart in terms of that comparative, in terms of the framework, in terms of what your role is there. The second useful thing to discuss is, okay, when you have this broad direction, how do you style your speech? How do you present in an effective way in line with these goals? And then how do you structure your speech? How do you do the practicalities of your speech in order to make sure that you're covering everything? And once again, if you have any questions, just flick them below. There was a yo from someone. That's very nice. Yo to you as well. Let's chat about style. Obviously, it's difficult. Well, there's a lot of temptation to be prescriptive here. This is what a good first speaker style looks like. Here's how you achieve it. When obviously a big problem is that there's a huge amount of different approaches stylistically. And so what I'm going to isolate here is not necessarily unique styles that are useful or that should be copied. Of course, I'm going to discuss a range of different styles, but really the goals behind these styles, what they're trying to achieve within particular speeches. And I think if we take some very contrasting first speakers, you're able to see the way in which this different scope operates. So on the one hand, you have first speakers who are just deeply reasonable to listen to, speak very prettily, speak very nicely, present ideas in a very slow, clear way. And the real value of having a speaking style at first that's a little bit slower is remember that you're not necessarily trying to cover off every possible opportunity. Rather, you're trying to impress certain fundamentals upon the judge, convince them that certain the way that a couple of incentives operate that will then be fleshed out and weaponized by your second and third speakers operate, just really carries weight within the debate because it's grounded within reasonable examples, grounded within a reasonable understanding, and it's explained definitely to sufficiency in a clear way. And so if you take speakers like Asher Emanuel, what set their speaking style apart was really their just willingness to tell very simple stories, willingness to try and make the debate very clear and very concise, and just very simple and solid for the judge. You can see how that would then become a very effective foundation for the much more scrappy speakers in that golden era of Vic teams that came afterwards, was able to take that useful analysis, weaponize it in ways that are responsive, that are able to grapple with the opposition. And so you can definitely see the value of a very slow, clear first speaker. I think a group that could potentially be contrasted with is, for example, Steph White from Sydney, who speaks very, very quickly and gets through a huge amount of material and is quite like a strong, powerful speaker as opposed to a slower, trying to be reasoned speaker. And the reason why this is once again effective is it's still tilted towards the same goals. It just does it slightly differently. So the goal is still to provide a very solid seeming world, a world that can shift with, of course, the different details that'll be filled in later, but seems very clear and reasonable to the adjudicator. But the approach there isn't just to focus on a couple of fundamentals and very clearly explain them, though. I think one of the things that allows Steph to be an effective speaker while being very, very quick is the fact that she had exceptional clarity. The goal within that type of speech is to lay down a huge breadth of material that gives a lot of room for your later speakers to maneuver and to get around. But remember, it's always linking back to those two ideas that come out of every good first speakers. They need to provide a clear world for the adjudicator, so that the adjudicator can start believing that world, can start buying into that world, but also needs to be giving material to their later speakers that they can weaponize, that they can shift around, that is durable within the debate, or at least is predictable within what we think the opposition is going to run. And I think this also falls into just our broader discussion of preemptive material. The way in which you stylistically incorporate preemptive material is an important skill as a first speaker, because what you want to do is not give the impression that you're being super preemptive, that you're trying to say that the debate is going to go 100% in this direction, and then because in that case the opposition uses that latitude that you've given them to try and shift the foundations of the debate. Be like, at first they thought the debate was going to be like this, but the debate has shifted and we think that leaves them in a big hole. And even if all of your analysis is still roughly relevant, if they're able to frame you into this box of backing the wrong horse or claiming the debate will be a certain way when it's not going to be a certain way, it creates the impression for the judge that the first speech to some degree has been wasted and to some degree not going to be useful. So the way in which you engage preemptive material is all throughout the lens of world building. It's throughout the lens of characterization, of fleshing out that solid, reasonable characterization. And if, for example, you think that a lot of this debate is going to be about incentives and you want to be preemptive towards the opposition, you can spend your time really fleshing out that actor, explaining all the different things that are operating on them, explain how they've gone through a couple of different scenarios or made reasoning. And even if you can't predict the particular attacks that will come from the opposition as to how necessarily they think that those interests or incentives will operate, and even if you could predict them, not wanting to fall into the trap of allowing latitude for the opposition to try and shift the debate by using a slightly different language and claiming it's entirely different material to the one that you were claiming, that material can still be durable within the debate. Because then when the second or third speaker comes to rebut that position, they don't need to do that from first principles and explain in depth how that scenario story plays out. They can point back to your speech and just be like, the first thing that I would note in response to this is that if you examine the material brought to us from our first speaker, you were able to identify these three things about why this character makes decisions that is unique to that actor, or a particularly strong influence on the actor from the material given to my first speaker, and then they can shift towards those specifics and do everything that a second and third speaker does in terms of picking holes in different arguments, polishing up little areas, and claiming that the responses from the opposition are uncomparative or are illogical or any of the other things that we discussed in our episode on responsiveness, but they can do so in a way that's still grounded within those stories, and then those stories can basically come alive to the adjudicator. The adjudicator can see them, can feel them, they feel much more solid, they feel much more real, and that's something that's very effective if you're a first speaker in terms of just giving your later speakers the best opportunity to weaponize material in an effective way, to walk through it in an effective way, and in order to really sell to an adjudicator the world that you're trying to convince them exists, from which all of the impacts or the framework that you've built flows on from. So that's what I think is important stylistically from a first speaker. It doesn't matter if you're a incredibly fast first speaker and burn through an enormous amount of material. It doesn't matter if you're a slower, more rhetorical first speaker who really just wants to impress a couple of small fundamentals. It's all about those two things, about giving the opportunity for your later speakers to weaponize material, to work with material that you've given down, and convincing the judge of the underlying plausibility of the world you're bringing, the underlying reasonableness that can then also be a huge benefit to the later speakers when they are trying to go through the nitty-gritty of dealing with the way that all the different tortured logics that come out within the debate operate. So that's stylistic, comes after a discussion of those general fundamentals. So I think last thing to discuss in this relatively free flow of dialogue for me. So if you have any questions, once again, just a reminder, flick a question into the comments and I'll respond to it as it comes up, is to talk about structure and how structure operates if you are a first speaker. And I think often what is important to think about here is, especially if you're a first neg speaker, there's a big question over to what degree do you integrate rebuttal, what degree do you have it separate, how do you set up your split, how do you do all those more administrative things that to some degree isn't present at a first affirming speaker, although I would actually argue that they potentially have a more difficult task because they have to generate something out of nothing. So let's look at the structures of these two speakers. First AF and first neg, see how they differ and see what both of these speakers are trying to achieve that necessarily just changes based on the huge contextual factor of you have the opposition's case versus you don't have the opposition's case. It'd be very interesting if we did what they did in mooting and had like written submissions in which you had to clearly state what you think your case is going to be, and then first speakers, well, of course they don't have the fleshed out versions of those cases. They don't, obviously there needs to be a first speech. They would then have the ability to at least know what to respond to or how to slant their case in order to make sure it is maximally responsive. But anyway, okay, let's talk about first affirming speakers. You are the first word within the debate, and you have very little idea of what's going to play out in the rest of you. There are a lot of very good first speakers and a lot of first speakers who are wildly overconfident about where they think the debate is going to go and try and hew too closely to this idealized vision that they have in their head. And that tends to be quite ineffective. These are often the speakers who get left behind by the debate because they haven't structured their case and they haven't thought about their case in a way that is going to be durable despite the surprises and changes that comes afterwards. So if you are a first affirming speaker and you have those goals that you had in the back of your mind that are stylistic, as well as being that are stylistic, as well as going to those fundamentals that we talked about, those are very similar factors that should apply to the way that you structure your speech. So firstly, you want to make sure that you are making a very plausible, believable world for your adjudicator. So within my introduction, and we had a long discussion in the last episode about how specifically to do setups and introductions, and we went through all the different speakers, but I'll just briefly rehash this here. What you are particularly wanting to be doing is convincing the judge as soon as you can that a particular world exists, that a particular problem exists within this world, or a particular basically a particular normative judgment exists in this world that's reflective of the world that exists, and then very strongly impress upon them that you're going to change a particular thing that shifts the way that thing operates. So as you're in your first speech, I often lean very strongly on telling a particular story that impresses all of these different things on you. It impresses you that there is a problem, it impresses upon you that there is a solution, and it impresses upon you that we should care about bringing about the solution. And then from there on, I think your role is very much just to generate momentum for your team, start convincing the judge that this is a well thought out, well fleshed out case and world that you are building. And so necessarily, I actually think that you should probably keep your introduction and setup quite short, quite sharp, because in many ways, the rest of what you're doing in your speech is often stuff that would be consigned to the introductions of later speakers, where you can really flesh out stories, you can dive into compelling examples, really deep dive into some of the incentives and how they operate, really give that foundational analysis that then goes on to get used. And as I said, I think it's very useful to have your different points be reflective of the framework that you're trying to bring. And remember, always frame your split, not just in terms of the subject area you discuss. I'm going to talk about incentives on this actor. Even from when you give that split, you need to be telling the judge what they want to take away with it. The first point, and I'll say this is a context point, the first point is that the incentives that operate on dictators or the goals of the dictator are this, and this means this. So you, within that sentence that you have explaining your particular point, you want to be able for the judge to write that down and basically have an understanding of where you're going to go within that particular point. And then as you get to each of those points, you can basically just set them up in roughly any way that you choose, but I would encourage you to at least have some of the context, so explaining to the judge, and often this context section is much larger in first speeches than any other speeches, giving your judge all the background that they need to know the point. And even if it's not something that is super useful to the way that your point operates, or it's a little bit peripheral, it's something that can be weaponized by your later speakers. They can point to that first speech and the grounding that it gives that case, and they can use it in a way that is weaponized. So when you're going through, often it's about being like, judge, within this broader point incentives, I have three things I want to walk you through. I want to walk you through how X incentive operates, I want to walk you through how X incentive operates, and I want to walk you how the last incentive operates, and then overall what you need to take away from this point is this thing that you'll discuss in an impacting little section of your speech, which is where at the end of each point, especially as a first speaker, really explain to the judge why this is valuable, what color it adds to the debate, where it is going to be useful. And remember, if you are a first speaker and say, for example, you're not bringing 40 mechanisms, but rather what you're doing is bringing one set of characterization, one set of that outlines a problem, one set of mechanisms that address it, and then one set of impacts or why we particularly care about this thing. That can all be rejigged by later speakers in terms of maximizing the impact of those points. So once again, you're going for a big, solid foundation as much as anything, and you're going to be wanting to be presenting it in a very, very clear way. And I think that has particular ramifications for the first neg. So I think that basically concludes our discussion on the first half. Like, obviously, every debate is slightly different. How you're going to want to achieve those things is going to be slightly different. But you always need to be thinking to the basics when you are doing a first speech, like what context is necessary to win this debate, what mechanisms are necessary to prove work, what are the impacts we want to claim, what are the comparative, what are our frameworks, and those basically three ideas will be structuring the entire rest of the debate, and you're trying to fill in all of those different things, not necessarily in the way that is directly impinged towards you winning the debate, but in the way that they can be used interoperably by later speakers to bring out the effectiveness of particular points, or to discuss or to weaponize analysis in ways that is very efficient on their end. So those rough ideas help you structure a first affirming speech. And remember, stylistically, it's all about generating momentum, about giving clarity to the adjudicator, making your world seem really solid. From a first neg, you have a little bit more latitude because you have something to push against. So after you've heard the first affirming speaker, obviously there's way more room for you as an individual to really tighten up your analysis and tighten up your arguments. And in many ways, I think that there's almost as much similarity between a first negating and a second affirming as there is between, say, a second affirming and a second negating, because you are in the first response position. You are really trying to engage with the world the opposition has brought, and you are tuning in all of the different points you bring to be directly responsive to those ideas. Okay, we have a question. How do you incorporate the framework and comparative as a first act into the structure? So that's a very good question. Often I'll do it very explicitly within my introduction. So those two ideas. So I'll tell a particular story. So I'll be like, and often you want to impress on the story. So I'll tell a story of, say the debate, this is a debate we did at Melbourne Online Open about whether or not activists, Indigenous activists should focus on building autonomous health systems or whether they should focus on reforming national health systems. The story that you want to tell is a very similar story on both sides of medical malpractice, of people not being taken care of, and then you dive directly into the comparative. There is a path in the road, and you can take one of two paths. So you're getting to your comparative there. On our side, and then you tell an effective story there. On their side, you tell an effective story there. So you really start building that context building into your introductions. And the reason why you should go with this world is because we deliver X, X, and X. So there comes your framework. So if you just follow that little 3-step introduction, identify the problem, identify the difference between the two things, explain why you should compare, prefer our world because of the things that you're proving. You've already done your context, you've already identified your comparative, and you've brought in your framework why you think the judge should care about particular things. And then the rest of your speech is justifying it. So that's a very short way to do it as your introduction. But note, it doesn't just need to be so the framework and the comparative aren't necessarily things that just need to be dealt with by themselves. They necessarily color your structure. So sometimes as a first speaker, I'll have a point just being like, what do we think is a reasonable comparative within this debate? And within that, you can nail down exactly what the two things are different. And then often you'll have a point that's being like, what do you care about this? So either you can do that as a separate point or you can do that at the end of each particular point. But I think it's useful for the adjudicator to have that as its own point. Why should we care about a particular thing? And that's like what is the problem? Where do we want to go point? And then, of course, you'll have your mechanistic points operating. That is like, why do we achieve the things that we want to lay out? So as you can see, you can shift those around. Sometimes it'll make more sense to strongly talk about the comparative. And literally, I sometimes use the comparative interchangeably with the word context, because really what you're doing there is you're not just saying the comparative in this debate based on the fiat of the negating team is they have to stand for this rather than this, that's like a burden discussion, but it's also about building the the world you want to do, and about trying to frame the opposition's case. So for example, in a debate we did at Melbourne Online Open about Indigenous activists, the comparative that we were drawing, and one of the reasons that we won the debate is because we identified with our comparative that what we're specifically talking about is not actually outcomes for healthcare systems. They can't magic into place an autonomous healthcare system. And obviously we are stuck within our constraints. It's what's particularly activists do. And then we told an effective story about what does it look like when activists who are very ordinary people act in this way, or activists activists from the same foundation act in the other way. But that mechanistic analysis necessarily came from a strong characterization of what activists were, what they cared about, what their incentives were, what doesn't change within the debate. And I think at first that was like the first thing we discussed. Why do we think that activists are particularly motivated to act in certain ways? What is some of their background? And then the later speakers, me and Brindy, could really impact that material or really ping it effectively against the case that the opposition had wanted to bring. But it all flowed from that really solid foundation that had been set up of that characterization of activists. So comparative isn't just talking about burdens, it's also actually starting to build that world, and then articulating where the change comes in that world and where the change doesn't come in that world, that symmetricality versus unsymmetrical, or a common set of foundations between both worlds, and then explaining how they have ramifications for the different comparative pathways that are flowing on from that. Okay, hope that answered. It's like another question yeah, okay, so I'll answer that in a sec, but first I'll just briefly discuss how to put your rebuttal as a first neg speaker. So I think there's roughly two approaches to doing this. So my approach, one that I advocate for very strongly, is making sure that you have basically I only use rebuttal sections for points that fall outside the rest of the stuff that I'm going to discuss. So at the end of my introduction, I will have gone through my split. Importantly, I'm going to talk about, it follows that I'll discuss three things here where we disagree with X point from the opposition, here where we disagree with X point from the opposition, and here, which is just like a unique spill-off. And then I'll say, but before that, two parts of the opposition's case that don't fit into how we think this debate should be judged, or don't fit in to a broader framework, don't fit in with the material that we want to phrase. Different ways that you can phrase it depending on the particularities of the point, but basically where material just isn't responded to through the rest of the points that you're going to be bringing. For example, if the debate has about like 500 different actors, you're going to wanting to be, often the affirming team will bring stuff that you actually have no preemptive material in regards to addressing. So what I'll do there is I'll pump up my rebuttal section, make it short, pithy, identify the particular bits that fall out of the debate, and then have 3 or 4 responses to that. And really what you're trying to do there is you're trying to smack it as hard as you can and hope that the opposition doesn't try and bring it anymore. So really just smack it. And note you have 2 later speakers who are able to respond very effectively to that material, but you're going to want to deal with it quickly and then just get onto your case. Because really remember what you're trying to do is you're trying to build your world as much as possible. And if you give just an incredibly responsive case, it can leave your case a little bit adrift, leave way too much work for your second and third speakers to do, try and fill in those gaps, and that can be really hard for them. So really short, sharp responses, then getting onto the important material within the debate. So when I chatted to Joe about this on Noise from the Bench, he also advocated similar for stuff that fell out of the broad ideas, but incorporating at least headline responses into your rebuttal section. So making sure you're responding to everything in a very brief way and then fleshing out your responses as you get later. I think this really depends on your discipline as a speaker. I find it a little bit tough to deliver a headline response without going into lots of detail. I find it hard to draw the line between like headline and detail. And so the way that I would try and do this is I would incorporate that straight into my split. So for example, when I say I'm speaking about 3 things, I make it very clear why X point. Remember, I'm always framing that point, wording that point, not just as a subject area, incentives, but why incentives do X, and then I can frame it. And so when the judge is writing down, this is kind of indistinguishable between my approach and Joe's approach, because they still get the headline of how you deal with the point, but it's very quick and allows you to get on to the other stuff. So really just depends on your discipline as a speaker, your ability to give those really short, sharp responses. And then obviously what you do is at the beginning of each point, you firstly state your case, what you think yours is, and then about halfway through, you start to incorporate that responsive material. So you'll explain your world. This is the way that we think the world operates. Let's compare it to what has been brought to us by the opposition. And I think potentially the most useful seminar that I've done is, once again, the responsiveness seminar. Went through all the different ways in which a point can be wrong, and then you can just slot in all of those different responses, that responsive material into dealing with that point, but dealing with it in a comparative way. So you have your material and you're directly comparing it to the other people's material, so that when you bring in particular attacks against that material, it feels very grounded in what you think will actually be happen. And then of course, at the end, you explain very clearly why you think your pathway is more plausible, more likely to happen than their pathway of going through things. Okay, how do you flesh out incentive points? That's a really good question. So firstly, I think we just have to distinguish what an incentive point is. They're like a subset of a much broader and potentially the most common type of point, which is basically just like a practical point. Why does X consequence follow X consequence? But we use incentive points when we want to talk about specific agents or specific actors that could have a multiple set of pathways, but are guided by the particular policy that we want to input in towards going one way or the other. So essentially, instead of having a direct effect, it has an effect on all the different ways that the rest of the system operates, well, the agents within that system operate, and then it's pointing them one way or the other in order to get further outcomes. So for example, we could have had an incentive points about what is the incentives of a, I don't know, governmental health administrator when Indigenous activists are pressuring for an autonomous system or pressuring just to reform that system. So you have another actor who your material depends on, and you want to try and readjust their incentives in order to do one thing or the other. So the way that I would flesh out those incentive points from a first speaker's perspective, of course, when you're a second and a third speaker, it's a little bit hard to give you like a rote perspective because you need to be very comparative. You need to look at what arguments the opposition has brought and then be comparatively shifting your argument in order to directly respond to the idea that they're bringing. Because even if you bring a really strong, effective explanation, if you're not doing it in a comparative way, bad judges all the time will be giving you losses because they're just being forced to make a judgment call between two material without having any direct guidance from the teams about how to respond to it. The way that I'd flesh it out as a first speaker is, so the first thing, you headline what you want them to do. So you'd be like, here is what we think healthcare administrators do. Here's the impact that they have. And this is very useful because then it doubles up at the end to explain why it's impactful, why you think it's going to be useful, but also those particular things are often the foundation of those incentives. So if the impact is them making X decision, and they make like lots of different decisions, but you want to focus on one specific decision, you also need to be specifying incentives that work on that exact decision. So it helps, once again, shoot down your analysis to being highly precise rather than just like general incentive analysis. The second thing I do from first is just walk through all of the incentives that operate on this actor. So healthcare administrators, we know that they care about their career. We know that they care about public pressure. We know that they are often reasonable and liberal and will be convinced if you make particular arguments to them from an indigenous perspective. So you go through all of those different incentives, and then each of them, you're pivoting towards why you think that helps in your case. So this makes them predisposed towards our position, or this makes them non-predisposed. And then lastly, and probably the bulk of your analysis, you focus exactly on the change that you want to make. And often as a first speaker, tell this as a story. So you've done your analysis of all the different, well, you've done like your analytical work of being like, here are the incentives that operate on a healthcare administrator: career, liberalism, ideology, blah, 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 blah. The way in which we then shift their behavior is to do X thing. And then what you do there is now you're able to tell a story. So I explain my change, I explain what I think my change is going to do. So if you are a healthcare administrator and your choice is between picking up this letter, reading it over the thousands of other complaints that you're going to get, you are substantially more likely to do that if you think it is going to be material that is pivoted towards an immediate solution that you can bring, rather than some like fantasy political alternative that they have no ability to control. And this is very important, once again, pivoting up to that first point, because what we are trying to incentivize these actors to do is to ensure that people are protected at first instance, to ensure that we have adequate application of medicine, blah, 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 walking through all those impacts. And the only way to do this is to adjust their incentives such that they're directed towards making these decisions differently. So that's how I flesh it out. So you have what particular change in decision you want that person to make. You have what exactly is necessary, what exactly incentives operate on these particular people traditionally. And then thirdly, walking through what the exact change is going to be, how you're able to tilt in one way rather than the other way in order to generate that particular change from that new incentive that you're building into the system. Okay, cool. So I think that's the end of the general discussion we're going to have about first speakers. So if you have any more questions, please flick them through and we can have a chat. Now I'm going to have a drink of my water. You can hear my flatmate playing music upstairs. It's very beautiful out here tonight. See, my phone is going to count this as screen time, but I don't think it should count as screen time because really I'm just monitoring whether or not I'm getting comments. Okay, another 30 seconds to ask comments. If not, we can sign off. Excellent. It was lovely as always to see you all, and I will see you next week.